12:05, so I think we'll get started. Welcome everybody to our special psychiatry grand rounds, and also happy fall. Can you believe it? So just to go through a couple quick announcements, we are offering continuing education credit, and CAC, Department of Psychiatry, is an approved sponsor of continuing education programming for psychologists. Also, LMFTs, LCSWs, the California BBS recognizes the American Psychological Association as an approval organization. To earn CE credit, most of you are familiar with this now, licensed therapists must be present for the entire length of the program and then complete an evaluation. There'll be a link at the end in the chat box, and also that link will be sent out with a summary and PowerPoint handout from the presentation. Today's grand rounds is worth 1 CE credit. Please complete the evaluation no later than Friday at 5 p.m. because the link becomes inactive at that time. And for CME, if you wish to obtain credit for CME, you must be in attendance for the duration. Only your attendance is required to receive the CME. We would appreciate your feedback in the survey, but that is optional, and also a link will be provided in the chat box at the end. So just a few words in providing some background about our speaker today and how I came to know her. We are all experiencing continued losses through this pandemic, and we are also experiencing gains, besides becoming experts in navigating Zoom and Teams. As I have mentioned in previous grand rounds, I am very grateful for the opportunities, particularly through my experience with the Care for Caregivers program, to develop relationships with people across USC and our health system that I would never otherwise have had a chance to meet. One of those gifts for me is getting to know Dr. Wewell, who is our speaker today. I met Dr. Wewell when she volunteered to run emotional support Zoom groups for our Care for Caregivers program, and we began to talk about her work as the director of USC's initiative to eliminate homelessness. The more I heard, the more I thought our department would benefit from hearing her enlighten us. So I invited her. Fortunately, she accepted, and here we are today. I will mention that Dr. Wewell has also been very generous with her time. She has been offering 2 Zoom drop-in groups a week for the past 5 months, and she continues to provide this volunteer service. So it is with great admiration that I introduce you to Brenda Wewell, DSW, LCSW, LMFT, the director of USC's initiative to eliminate homelessness. She is passionate about directing USC students and has research capacity to generate and implement effective solutions, believing that housing is a human right and a key element in the fight for social justice. During her doctoral studies in social work, she searched for ways to prevent homelessness, leading to the creation of an innovative program for high-risk adult women of color. Dr. Wewell is a champion for community engagement and consumer empowerment. She focuses on ways to take trauma along with racial and gender equity into account when planning, designing, and building social programs. She is also very involved in social work education at USC by providing experiential labs for social work master's students to develop a framework for understanding homelessness and effectively serving our homeless neighbors. During the summer, she worked with the social work doctoral students to guide them to design new programs that improve housing chances for Black people by addressing interfering structural factors. I am so enthused to hear your talk today, Dr. Wewell, and at this point, I will turn the floor over to you.
Well, I do want to thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I'm truly delighted to be here and to be able to share with all of you. When Barbara asked me to talk, I always say yes when anyone asks me to talk about homelessness, and I could probably go on for a long time, but I know we only have an hour, so I promise to keep it within that framework. But I do get pretty excited about the work that we do actually through the initiative. So if you could do the next slide, please. So this is just a short description. Not everybody is aware that USC actually has an initiative to eliminate homelessness. And it was actually started by the previous president as there was a lot of focus and activation around trying to make an effort in the community of Los Angeles County to impact homelessness. And we sit right in the middle. There was a need for us to jump in and really see how we could harness our resources, how we can get involved. And so a group of deans came together, and I came in as the director of the initiative, having a lot of experience in the community prior to that. I'm really proud of what we've done in the last 4 years. We've activated a number of centers working on homelessness. A bunch of different students have gotten involved. We have internships, we have volunteer work, we have research opportunities, and our students are learning a tremendous amount. They're going out there, they're taking the jobs, and they're making immediate and important contributions. So I just, again, I'm really proud of the initiative, and I'm glad to let you know that we have one here at USC. So next slide. Oh, we're not finished putting up that one. Sorry about that. So you can see our vision and our mission. We do have a great website that you're welcome to take a look at that's just packed with a bunch of reports and information in a bunch of ways. So the reason that the topic that we're talking about is important to me is that I have had the privilege to learn about racism. I know there's probably many of you in the audience who, on the other hand, have experienced it your whole life. And for those of us who are learning about racism, I feel like it's kind of a sacred duty and a moral obligation and an ethical obligation for us to understand. And for those of you who have experienced it, to be patient with us and allow us to interact and share and learn together so that we can work on it. So part of what I've done with this presentation is to focus it, to shine it back into the structure of your organization, as well as what it means to be homeless for people who are experiencing homelessness. And a lot of what it's really about for me is really helping people to understand, if you're gonna really understand homelessness, which a lot of people say, well, why is there so many homeless? How can we understand what this issue is? I feel that if you look at homelessness through the lens of structural racism, you're gonna pick up such an important piece of it that, and it's such a priority to do, that it's where we need to start and focus our energy, prioritize ourselves, and really look at how we can work in that area. So I wanted, with this talk, I really want to challenge all of you to look at some of the material and what it means for how we as healthcare providers, we as mental health providers, we as homeless service providers are really going to be able to do something that's going to make a difference. Next slide. Can you go ahead and put the rest up? There's a few more pieces. There we go. So just to frame this, I think it's important to remember that we had our highest homeless count in January of 2020 that we'd had in quite a while, with in one night finding 66,436 people. It was a 13% increase. And for context, there's 21,000 available housing units that we have with our shelters, our bridge programs, and our permanent supportive housing units when they do the housing count that they do. Next slide. So the next slide that we're going to look at is really going to focus on, oh dear.
Sorry, Brenda, I'm working on it. There's a little glitchy things with the slides, but we'll continue to try to move through these.
Okay, so my little picture is covering up part of it, and then part of it is not fully showing. But what I can tell you is that if you look at the homeless count, out of that 66,000, 22,588 were Black Americans, Black people living here. And that was actually a 15% increase. So this year, they represented about 34% of all people experiencing homelessness. In past years, it's been 40%, and it's stayed at that level quite a bit. And that's the same as the national level. So that's, I think, a really important piece to just remember, that if we want to solve homelessness, why not start there? So if we want to move on, the next slide is going to tell you a little bit about some of the disparities in the areas where most Black people are actually residing. And one of those is in South Los Angeles. And what you're going to find in South Los Angeles is that SPA, which is the Service Planning Area 6, contains 16% of all people experiencing homelessness. Of all people it's 16% of the let's see, let's go to the slide and see if we can see it. Okay, so it's 16% of all of the people who were counted as homeless on that one night. So that one SPA has 16%, which is a pretty high number, but just take into account the resources that they have access to. When the county got involved with COVID and realized that it was necessary to be able to expand resources for people who were unsheltered, and they worked with the state to open up the project room key beds at hotels and motels, SPA 6 got 2% of all the beds in the county. So what you can see is that the incredible disparity between the needs and the resources that are available where the segregated communities are is really something to keep an eye on. Next slide. Okay, so when I was studying, working on my doctorate, I did a lot of research. And one of the things that in pretty much all the research studies and all of the reports, they would always do a racial breakdown. And you'd always see Black people, Black Americans at the top of the list. But nobody ever called it racism. I never saw that. And none of us did either, actually, including myself. We noticed it, we were upset about it, but we didn't really talk about it. So I kind of looked to see where the problem was being really named. Next slide. And what I noticed was that back in 2018, LAHSA, which is the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, they operate and administer all of the funding to all of the groups that are providing homeless services, the whole range of them, money coming from the federal government, money coming from the county, such as Measure H and other pots of money. So they realized there was a problem, and actually who realized it, I believe, was Mark Ridley Thomas, and then the supervisor that covers the Service Planning Area 6, and one of the members of the SPA Commission, Jacqueline Wagner, who runs Enterprise Partners, and she had done a project on redlining and began to look at how can we really better understand why we have this persistent disparity. So they put together a commission, an ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness. They held meetings throughout the year, and at the end of the year, they provided a big report with a bunch of recommendations. And this was their conclusion. Ending homelessness will require a collective commitment to dismantling racism and addressing racial disparities. So that was the first place that I actually saw racism being named in connection with the large numbers of Black people in every study, in every way, for any kind of disparity. Next slide. Then came Black Lives Matter. And now we're in a phase where suddenly it's become socially acceptable to start naming racism. So this year, in May, when LASA put out its report looking at, giving the community an overview of what was actually going on in terms of homelessness, for the very first time out of any of the years that I've seen any of their reports, they identify the effects of systemic racism, and they highlight the alarming result in terms of homelessness. So finally, we're in a position now where it's being named, it's being looked at, and we have the opportunity. I feel like it's a great opportunity to really harness that willingness and look at all of our systems that create, maintain, and sustain the kind of systemic racism where the result is that 1 out of every 4 people who are Black on the streets in Los Angeles County, you got it, in LA County, 1 out of every 4 people are Black. So next slide. So trying to understand this, I've taken a couple of slides from the research done by a colleague through the School of Social Work under the supervision of Dr. Eric Rice. The slides are by Dr. China Hill, who just finished her PhD, and she really studied homelessness and racism. And it's now become part of a new research project that was recently funded where USC and UCLA are really looking deeply into the way that we categorize and prioritize who gets housing. What they did is they did it based on equality, but not equity. And when they looked at it, they realized that there was some ways they might be able to change the algorithms that could be put into place so that we could get a more equitable result. Because what we were seeing, one of the biggest responses that came out of the ad hoc committee was that Black people were getting placed as quickly, according to LASA's data, but they were falling out of homelessness much more frequently and not able to sustain it. So we wanted to see what could be done about that. And there's some really interesting new research that it's in the process right now. But out of the beginnings of that, what they began to look at was, well, how do we really understand the history of it? Those of you who have looked at the New York Times or listened to the New York Times 1619 podcast will recognize some of this, and I highly recommend that. But it takes you all the way from the point that the first Africans arrived in the United States, all of the different kinds of laws that were put in place. Next slide. All the way up, all the way up to the most recent time in the 1980s that have had impacts of very high significance. First, there was a lot of legal kinds of things with the Jim Crow laws, with after the war, where people were given small plots of land and then they were taken away. And then after World War II, as people came back who had been fighting, the way that the resources were allocated, and the ways that the covenants that allowed people to get mortgages interfered for people who were Black, and didn't allow them to be able to purchase land in suburbs, and didn't allow them to be able to gain mortgages in those areas. So just studying the history makes you realize all of the different ways that white supremacy has been structuralized and incorporated in ways that we may not even see now, but continue to impact us. Next slide. So intentional redlining, no longer legal. It was outlawed. However, Black borrowers, many studies have shown this. They're routinely charged higher fees, higher interest rates. There's a higher denial for Black home mortgage applications. And then if you look at renters, they represent a much higher percentage, and the most low income level of renters, so that 48% of Section 8 voucher holders are Black. But then what you see over and over again is in many cities, including in Los Angeles, that landlords often won't accept the vouchers, and they have all their different reasons for it. However, what that does is it creates one more kind of barrier and obstacle that ensures that what you see are people homeless on the streets. There's a really interesting set of videos, and I had picked one out for some of my social work classes, that shows a woman in, I think it's Oakland, and she talks about how she got a voucher 2 or 3 different times, and every place that she went to try to use her voucher, they wouldn't take it for all kinds of different reasons. So those are some of the kinds of barriers that we still see in place. And what you also see is the Black home ownership rate is only 7% higher than it was in 1950. So the white supremacy laws have been incredibly effective at shutting out Black families from being able to live in places that might be of, have some value and worth, and really overall, if you look at the big picture, this has really been devastating and a big factor in the fact that there's so many people on our streets who are our Black neighbors, who are unsheltered or struggling with housing. Next slide. So current racial wealth gap, net worth of a typical white family, $355,000 versus $3,500. And this is really because the way that wealth happens is through property. So if your family was a GI coming back from the war and you were able to buy property in the 50s or the 60s, and then you were able to turn that over time, the wealth that you have now in your home has appreciated. But if you were never able to get a toehold in that, how could you possibly end up with a family wealth? So the effects of this accumulated inequality, discrimination, power, opportunity goes way back, and it represents what we're seeing now and is really a key foundation in the type of homelessness that we struggle with. Next slide. And finally, the housing cost burden by race. If you look at the poverty levels, what you'll see is that Black people have the highest cost burden. The cost burden is that their rent is greater than 30%. Severely cost burdened is their rent is greater than 50%. So what you see is the level of poverty that is this disparity. And this has been known before. It's just never been called structural racism before. So I appreciate that we now can call it what it is, based on white supremacy. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about residential segregation and the link to health, because this has actually been studied and I think is an important link, given that we want to understand health and healthcare and homelessness in combination. So there's a lot of health associations that have been documented in relation to the kind of residential segregation that we have in Los Angeles and throughout the country. So you can see there's a bunch of them there, but also the big piece of it is reduced access and utilization of local care. There aren't the kinds of clinics that meet people's needs as actively or accessible, and the quality of the resources in terms of what's available and how it's accessed is just not the same. Next slide. So I found this really interesting because I did a little research and I found a report that was put out by the Institute of Medicine in 2002, which focused on substandard care due to racism. So I said I hadn't seen it labeled, and then I found this. So I thought this was really interesting because it was out there, but nobody paid attention. It was clear that systemic and pervasive bias based on race was present and that it was perpetuated by healthcare institutions, including systems that educate and train providers. So this is my slide to say, have we improved since 2002? And what can we do to keep moving the needle forward? Next slide. So in terms of the health disparities, there's been a lot of kinds of news recently about the disparities in terms of COVID for people of color. And I just found this really interesting. The conclusions in terms of the numbers of deaths per whatever that is. What was interesting about that is that identified that Black Americans received less aggressive care, and they were also older. So they had more pre-existing conditions. So there's a number of different factors that relate to structural racism that affected these numbers that you see and what the difference is between 70 and 30. Next slide. So now I want to focus a little bit on mental health because that's always been my area and an interest for me. And so I wanted to look a little bit at, first of all, how does racism affect mental health? And so there's just really strong evidence for adverse effects on psychological well-being that has been documented, and including physiological impacts, as noted, the disease biomarkers, allostatic load, inflammatory markers, hormonal dysregulation. All of this has been documented in research. In addition to that, the understanding is that structural racism creates a level of stress that Black Americans are potentially subject to that others are not. And as you can see, and as we know, if there's a positive level of stress, it just gets us up and going. A tolerable level of stress is something that we go through periodically in our lives. But toxic stress is where you get prolonged activation of stress response systems in the absence of protective relationships. And I feel that racism creates a lot of experiences for people, even though they may have some protective relationships, where there's just not enough when you have that prolonged activation with all of the different stressors. So we'll look at that a little bit more. Next slide. So there's quite a bit of research actually on the sources of race-related trauma. And I want to really focus on this because I've studied trauma a lot. I've tried to help develop trauma-informed service systems and teach people about trauma so they're looking at the lens of trauma. And all of that time, I left out race-related trauma. And it was only much more recently, maybe within the last year, I started to write an article on stress and trauma, where I began to look at the research and became much more familiar with the data and realized that when we're talking about trauma, for many of us, we've been leaving this out. And it's interesting because I have some connections with people who are very active EMDR practitioners. And I was talking with one who runs a training program for that. And they've just added this. And think how long Francine Shapiro has been. I mean, I don't know, it's like maybe 20, 25 years at least. And they've just added this. So there are some really interesting studies on this. Just in general, what you can see is there's some intergenerational trauma that's been identified based on parental styles and bonding, based on the kinds of trauma that people have experienced. And there's some interesting data on the epigenetic processes that lead to actual biological reactivity that is transmitted through the genes from parental experiences. So there's also, though, a lot of systemic harm based on the different obstacles and barriers that people face when they face discrimination based on race. And that can happen to anyone. It can happen to professors at USC. It can happen to students at USC, as we've seen in some of the recent information that's come out. So those kinds of systemic harm are important to understand when you're working with somebody. What is the impact of just the generalized marginalization, the violence, the abuse that one may come across either in their community or in their lives that has a link to racism? The daily racism-related micro-stressors and how those can build up, and just the chronic environmental stress of segregated communities that don't have, where the basic needs are not really met. So this also identifies a bunch of more detailed information that you can look at your leisure. But I just feel like race-based trauma has been missing in our conversation to understand trauma and when we're working with our clients and patients. Next slide. So I encourage myself and all of my colleagues to start looking at racism when you're diagnosing. There's been some really interesting studies that have showed some of these types of key factors that might be present in complex PTSD. And I've never considered them in the past. This was new when I started doing my research in the last year. And I thought of the times that I had diagnosed complex PTSD without really considering what was the role of institutional racism? What was the role potentially of implicit biases by doctors, other health professionals, myself, in terms of how that may be impacting the picture, the kinds of anti-Black discrimination that somebody may have experienced, and the home community with potentially high levels of violence. And I say this, it's interesting because in South LA, Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas identified 2 areas that he looked at the research, and he found that there was a higher level of violence, like murders and like really intense violence in those 2 small neighborhoods than anywhere else throughout the United States. And so what he did is he started to work with the public health department and brought in some programs to try to do trauma healing that was race-based in those areas. And they're still launching. There's some interesting processes going on with that. And if anyone has any questions or wants to know more about that, I'd be happy to share that with you or connect you with the people who are involved. The next slide. So just to frame structural racism, I believe, and I think somebody else might because I found this somewhere, structural racism is a public health crisis. It protects racism. You don't see it. It's a complex interchange and interaction between institutional policies and behavior that ends up with the kinds of consequences and impacts that we can potentially measure, but we don't count it because you can't really see it. Next slide. So how do we address racism in our own systems? We have to be proactive. We have to be intentional. And we have to work toward creation of an anti-racist, anti-discriminatory work environment. And I know in the past, even when we were talking about the ad hoc committee, when I'm on the COC board, which is the Loss Continuum of Care board, and the first time somebody talked about the ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness, somebody said, well, what about Latinos and what about, and began to bring up other groups to say, well, they have experienced discrimination as well. And I want to say that I believe that if we address racism that's anti-Black racism, the kinds of systems that we'll end up with will be absolutely supportive and uplifting and beneficial for everyone. I feel like this is our weak point, and if we can strengthen this, it will go a long way toward everyone's health. The next slide. So here's my vision for where I want myself and all of us as health professionals to go. I want to see us advancing health equity, and that's what's going to improve population health, which, as we know, is the big picture. It's not talked about quite as much now as it was when Obamacare was in, but I still feel like it's there and it's important and it's got to be part of our systems. So the difference, which many of you have probably seen, if we go for equality, this is what we're going to end up with. Some people are not going to get what they need. We have to go for equity. And I found this really interesting because I was talking with one of my social work students and we were talking about the spas. And when spas were created in the, it must have been back in the 90s maybe, in LA County to separate sections, what they did is they said, we want to have equal numbers of people in every area, equal numbers of population, so that way we can make sure that everyone has access to the services, right? So what we what happened as a result of that is they drew boundaries which were equal, right? But they didn't take into account segregated communities and the fact that in South LA, they could not find hotels. They weren't there when they were looking for Project Roomkey. That's why they only got like 2% of them. All the hotels were in other areas. So if you don't take equity in account along with equality, that can be part of the picture, but you have to take equity in account, or you're not going to be able to achieve the goals to meet the needs of everyone around health, which and economic well-being, which is what drives homelessness. So next slide. I just want to say just a little bit about critical race theory, because a lot of people in medicine and a lot of people in the area of trauma are now encouraging us to utilize critical race theory. I found a couple of quotes that I thought were really interesting because they were really focused on both public health and medical education. So next slide. So critical race theory is interesting to me, and it provides a really interesting framework because it focuses, it allows experiential knowledge to be part of the picture. It's interdisciplinary and primarily intersectional. So it looks at not just, are you the race of Black American? It might also say, well, what's your gender? What's your preference in terms of your gender preference? It looks at all, are you a veteran? It takes into account all of those issues in trying to understand, but it challenges some of the dominant theories and ideas. It looks at it and says, well, how might that theory have not taken into account structural and historical racism? Or how might the research that was being done and the questions that were being asked not taken into account structural racism and therefore not quite as valid? How can we interrupt racism? How can we create stories that tell the bigger picture and really allow us to better understand what we're looking at? We need to analyze unconscious bias. We need to analyze privilege. Where is our cultural competence? What are the types of stereotypes that we might be laboring under, and where are the microaggressions? So it's a complex theory, but I think it's valuable and I wanted to share it with you. I'm hoping that more and more we'll teach our students about this and we'll be able to look at how we can incorporate this into medical and mental health treatment. Next slide. So the big goal in my mind is, how do we create racial justice? It means that we're going to reinforce policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power and equitable impacts and outcomes for all. And the indicator is that the outcomes across race will show that we're able to do that. Next slide. And I just wanted to end with this because this is hot off the press. Looking at where we're going for a more equitable and inclusive Los Angeles, there's been a lot of effort now with starting from Black Lives Matter and looking at how do we alter our priorities and our funding that could be healthier and produce more well-being for people. They created, through the county's Human Relations Commission, a committee for Greater Los Angeles, and to create kind of a framework for systemic change. And it addresses structural racism and has a bunch of really interesting recommendations with very specific, interesting requirements around homelessness, housing, and health. And what's exciting about it is one of the key authors is our very own Dr. Manuel Pastor, who runs the USC Dornsife Equity Research Institute. Fascinating report. It's called No Going Back. And I hope that in the future we're able to take some of the information I've given you, as well as those kinds of recommendations, and really restructure the ways that we interact and the ways that we frame our institutions so that we can abolish structural racism and end up with a much better health and well-being. And to me, that's really the core and the foundation of ending homelessness. But I want to add just one final thought. If you're working with a patient who's homeless and you're looking at how to assess them, I do want you to really try to make sure that you include as many of the kinds of things that are involved with critical race theory and the kinds of things that might relate to race-related trauma as you go through your assessment process, so that what we end up with is people getting the care and getting caring providers who truly understand what their experience is and are really, truly able to provide the kind of help that they need. So I'll end there. I did end a little early, hopefully if there was some questions or we wanted to have some discussion.
Wow, I knew I was looking forward to your talk, Brenda, but so impactful. Really amazing work. While I make a few comments, I'm going to welcome our attendees to use the Q&A function to raise questions or make comments. I thank you so much for your informative historical overview of structural racism in the US and how it impacts our current racial inequities, not just in housing, but also in healthcare and mental health care. You certainly raised and I think I will speak for the audience, our consciousness about being sensitive to race-based trauma, and also in consideration when we make our diagnoses. I really appreciate your incredibly humble stance. And I just want to reiterate the quote you shared at the beginning of your talk. It was very powerful for me, and it will stay with me, which is, quote, "It is a privilege to be able to learn about racism instead of experiencing it your whole life." And I think it is our obligation to all get involved in whatever ways we can, and even try to partner with your initiative more to try to break down the barriers that we've put.
I would love that. I'm always looking for new partners. I'm always looking for ways. I had 12 Masters of Public Health students this summer, and I still have 6 of them, and they're doing amazing things. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate all the work that Brett is doing with the Street Medicine Institute or program, and there's a lot that we can do around homelessness.
So we do have a comment. Great talk. Thank you so much. And that's probably the voice of the 90 attendees that we've had today. Would you say a little bit about some of the projects could you say a little bit more in detail about what you're doing or done with the students?
Well, I've got students actually from a variety of different areas. And then I also track what different kinds of research is being done to try to promote the visibility when there's a link to homelessness. So if anyone is engaged in any kind of research that has a link to homelessness, please let me know about it, because I like to include it on my website. We've got a LibGuide through the libraries that's got links to all the researchers who are working in that field, and I want to make sure we continue to add to that. Probably one of the areas that I'm kind of excited about right now is working around children who are homeless and some of their needs. And I've got one social work student who is focusing on that. And she's going to be working with LASA hired navigators. No, not yeah, LASA hired navigators, but then LACO, which is the school, the LA County Office of Education, hired other coordinators. And what we see is that the kids get lost in both systems. They get lost at the schools and they get lost at the homeless service agencies. There's different people responsible for different aspects. One's supposed to focus on their education and one's supposed to focus on their housing. And the systems are not talking well. So we're looking at how we can help contribute to that. And so that's an exciting one. Then I have 3 urban planning students who are looking at community land trusts, because in order for us to be able to solve housing, we have to have housing. And part of the reason that even in South LA, they're going to, in the next couple of years, they're going to be building close to 1,500 or maybe even 2,000 units of housing. However, they have 5,000 homeless on the streets right now. So we don't have enough housing for people. And so that's one of the areas I've been trying to work with architecture, urban planning, and policy on. But in terms of health, that's my area of, and mental health, that's an area that's important to me. I've written with a colleague a paper which is listed on my website, and then also under the Homeless Research Policy Institute, which is HPRI, that focuses on trauma and the link between trauma and homelessness. So I could probably go on forever, but I'm going to stop.
If you could share that with me. I mean, a large majority of our faculty and certainly our trainees are provide services at LACUSC, and so that's mostly all actually uninsured population for the most part. We have a lot of homeless patients that do present unique challenges. So information that you could point my way, that article, I can include it when we send out the handout and also the CME links. I also see that Gretchen did put information about the surveys in the chat. And so another question just came through in our last couple minutes. What about homelessness in college students?
Well, that's a big issue. There are primarily in the community colleges. However, when I first started at USC, we didn't really have any infrastructure at all. And so we did we put a committee together to look at it. And then we did an initial survey, realized that we did have some hungry and homeless college students even at USC. And as a result of that, the Trojan Pantry opened. Some students on their own opened the Trojan Shelter, which is small, but mighty. And then we started trying to build, one of our recommendations was to create like kind of a one-stop place. And so there is now a manager of basic needs at USC trying to kind of coordinate resources for USC students. I'm sending out a newsletter shortly and there's an article in there that's a great article on college homelessness written by a USC student who was one of the founders of the Trojan Shelter. And he got it published. I forget where it was published, but we're going to link it and highlight it in my next newsletter. So I'm happy to send that link as well if you're interested, because I think his article really creates a nice framework of the big picture, but it's something of importance as well.
That would be informative. A large majority of our faculty also work at student health, so that would be of particular interest. I just want to also applaud you for the work you're doing with children. My daughter in San Jose is a high school history teacher, and when I was asking her how it's going with the virtual platform and format now, since classes are all remote, one of the major issues she's struggling with, and I hadn't even considered that a lot of her students are homeless. So there is nowhere for them to go to be private, and they don't have access, and
Yeah.
had not even really given that a lot of thought. So yes, it's truly a pervasive issue across all ages.
There was a really interesting article in the New York Times that focused on homeless students, not college students, but homeless students, like you're saying, elementary and high school. And they did a podcast on the daily. They did it as a podcast. I'm also going to be featuring that. It just broke my heart. I couldn't stop crying when I listened to it and read it, but it's important to understand, and we've got to activate to make sure that families and kids have their basic needs met. And we all know it, but we don't seem to be doing enough about it.
So on that note, hopefully that will encourage.
Yes, motivate everyone to get involved and what you can. We can build our own USC Army.
Brenda, thank you so much for, on behalf of the whole Department of Psychiatry, thank you for being here today and sharing this information with us and hopefully motivating us to get more involved. And I wish everybody who's still on to have a good day.
It was my pleasure and a delight. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.